So whenever I start a sketch, I always start with a very similar deviation of a rectangle in perspective. So this rectangle I always put down and use as my base to make sure I have my vanishing points really set in stone. For this one, I'm drawing a building, so I want to have something that is showing a little bit more of the front face and then foreshortening the back a lot. So I'm going to have my perspective be decently extreme so that it really makes the building feel pretty long. And you can see here, I'm not really worried about how tight everything is. It's allowed to be messy because this light, loose sketch is going to be covered up over time. There's one thing to think about is if you're going to drastically change what you actually draw with the light marker, keeping it within the boundary of the actual end result. It's a little bit hard to think about that up front, but if you can, it's going to have everything that goes on top of it covered up. But if you go outside of that boundary, those lines are much harder to actually conceal later. But for now, we're just gonna think about what I actually want and how big it is and where our actual major touch points are going to be. So right now, I'm gonna think about how to split it, splitting an object, put an X across it, and then put your lines in perspective, which means the center of the building is back here, more or less. And I know I want to have a walkway down the center, so here's the middle. So I'm gonna pull this guy back a tiny bit, and then this one back a tiny bit. This one is good to think about the scale of what I'm drawing. So right now, I'm looking at it and it feels like it's very fat, but it's something that I need to be aware that the people in it are going to be pretty small compared to what I usually draw. So the idea behind this guy is that it's basically a house that splits and then it has a void down the center, and then I take each half and shift them again. So you end up with two trapezoids on each side that when you look at it from the front makes a silhouette of a house, but when you see it in reality, it actually is much more dynamic and interesting. This one I'm going to make the perspective a little exaggerated for the roof line, so it's pulling back down. I love the Scandinavian buildings, which have those very drafted roofs. That way the snow and ice will fall off of them. And I'm gonna slightly try and pull these lines outward. Just to give it a nice effect. And this vanishing point is somewhere over here, so my top line is going to be pretty extreme going down. And then if I wanted to, I could try and think about this is going to go across to here and over. So that means this is about, if I want these to be at the same height, kind of call it a golf swing, like a fake line going across. Goes down to here, which means this would be the front face if I was making a square, and then pull that into perspective this way, so it's actually about right there. And then from here, I want this to go there. And actually, I'm looking at this. This is gonna go, I want there to be a little pathway through here. I'm gonna pull this back. So this whole section is basically getting proportions right. Proportions are something that you can never think through enough. An object is always as good as its proportions. And if you get those wrong, the whole thing can fall apart pretty quickly. So this is a step that I always try and tweak and keep making it tighter and tighter over time and make it until it's at a place where I feel pretty confident about it. So this is here, it's gonna go down that way. I want this ridge line to follow all the way up, but I'm kind of thinking that I want it to be a little bit wider. You can see I'm constantly rotating my page. It's something I always do when I draw is basically don't bend your arm to fit what you want. Move your page to match the natural stroke of your arm that's going to give you the straightest lines possible. So I move my page pretty frequently. Always thinking about my perspective. and making sure it's always on point. Like right now, this is pretty steep and that's not, so I need to change this guy to go a little more on the steeper side. So I'm gonna pull this further out, which now makes this roof line pretty long, but that's okay. And now I'm looking at this and realizing my perspective is off. You can see this line's going here, but this line is not. So I want to pull this one down further, this one down further, and now it's starting to get closer. So you can see I'm not too concerned about making everything completely perfect the first go around. Right now I want to make this alleyway a little bit bigger. I think that this is looking pretty good. But from here, I'm starting to get the perspective. And now once I have this down, I can now take this to the next step and start tightening it up. But before I do, I just want to make sure everything is exactly what I want. Put a little more tight lines down that are a little more committed. So going over here, so I'm trying to imagine my vanishing points. I pulled this guy back. So now this should be, this point's closer to you, so this point should be higher than that one because of the perspective going to this vanishing point. And then I want to say that this little roof line up here is actually connecting the two structures and following the ridge line or the roof line. So I'm going to put that in, and that's where it's going to be a nice bedroom. And the perspective's not perfect, but it's almost there. And now when I go back later, I can clean it up and I can start adding in the extra little details that I'm going to want to know later. Like this. This is going to be a steel beam that intersects into the house. Because I'm trying to think about my perspective, it's going like this. So right here should be about almost straight across. That's making that little ridgeline building room I want up there. This is gonna keep going through the whole thing since this top part's gonna be glass. And then I want there to be, in here, there is going to be a kitchen area. So I want to draw in, just basically thinking about some cabinetry and everything. And this is also going to start helping to set the scale, where these cabinets are supposed to be 3 feet tall. So that looks way bigger than 3 feet. So I'm going to pull that down to about there and then use this as the backsplash. This is the depth of those cabinets, or this is the counter space. Just give myself a few little reference points that I can use. And then above this, up into the ridge line of the roof, there's going to be some type of cabinetry, something or other. This is the floor of this guy. You're gonna see a little bit of it. And there's gonna be a bed in there. Just something that's floating up the stairs. And yeah, so from here, I basically have most of what I want. I know over here, there's going to be vertical lines. So just kind of rough those in. I'm gonna do the same for here. And then right here, there's going to be this nice wooden patio. But in the corner, I would like to make it where there's actually a fire pit. So I'm gonna draw a steel backed little wall. So that way I can have a fire pit right here, making through perspective the whole time. And that feels a little tall, so I'd probably pull it down to there, but at the same time I want there to be some thickness to this edge right here. In the long term, it's okay. It's basically putting things in. This is gonna be the wood planks that make my little deck area. And then inset inside of here, you can see it through the glass, is going to be a really high vaulted door, with the door actually probably right here. something like that. And once you have your base sketched down in the building, it's always good to think about the composition of the page. So right now, this guy is pretty evenly kind of weighted in the middle of the page. There's a little more white space over in the bottom right corner. There's a decent amount in the bottom left corner, but the tops are pretty filled in and don't need too much to actually make the page feel balanced. So for right now, I'll kind of think about where I want to put the title of this thing. I usually put it in the place with the largest amount of white space. So I'll just kind of ghost in a little box there for right now. That's where my title will eventually go. And I kind of think I would like to put some type of visual call out. So I'll probably put that guy, I'm trying to think just where I can put a nice little circle on here. And I'll probably put it right here. And that's gonna be a call out of this guy. So from here, now you can see I can take little notes later to fill it in, kind of say what the material was happening here, what's going on, and just putting in one more detail. Now I basically have my whole sketch ready to go. I can take it further with actual pens, and then once my actual drawing is tightened up, start putting some marker on it. So once you have your base sketch done in a light marker, now it's time to go and start actually tightening it up. So this is a space where you can actually be creative, think things through, change details, and kind of set yourself up for success for actually having the perspective and the composition where you want it to be before you spend the time actually making this thing really nice and tight and have all the marker rendering on the actual sketch that you started with. So to do that, I always start with a ruler and a very thin pen. So this references back to some of the tutorials we did previously about line weight. So line weight is something that helps make a page look dynamic, but also helps you set the foundation for what everything is actually going to do, since you're putting hard lines down, not just light lines, which you can change. But when you're doing something like this, it's always good to think from the front to the back. You want to think about what are the lines that are closest to the foreground that are going to cover up everything behind it. If you don't think about this, you might end up drawing a line. For example, I could draw this whole line for the back of the house, which you do see in some parts, but if I did that first, then all of a sudden I can't fix that when I'm trying to draw the lines in front of it, and you're going to have this weird feeling of translucency where you can see that line and it shouldn't be there, and you don't want to make things confusing for your audience. You want to make it as clear as possible. So for this one, I always look at what's in the foreground and what's the longest line I can possibly draw. So for this guy, I think this right here is a good starting point. Since it's pretty long, it's going to my vanishing point, and it's really far forward, so nothing is going to ever supersede it in the hierarchy that's actually foreshortening. So for this one, I don't like how my perspective is. I think it should be a little bit more up. So this is the chance for you to kind of course correct, figure out where your perspective should be, and to start committing to those lines. So now I have my first line down. This one line is going to be the thing that I kind of base everything else off of. So I'm gonna keep moving forward and start adding all the bits and pieces that I know I want. So here we go. And you don't have to use a ruler. A ruler is something I like to start out with because it makes me be super slow and really think through all the lines and make sure I'm actually getting them correct. And also cleans them up in such a nice way that they just look really meticulous by the time you're done. So I've identified these two lines, and now I'm going to start thinking about the vertical. So this guy, I want to pull in right here. And then I'm now looking at it. These are kind of going together. I want them to be going to the bottom. So I'm going to start with this guy next and thinking about where they're all going to meet up. So if this is all going to this vanishing point, I think I want to try and do this one next. And sometimes what I'll do, if I'm not sure, I'll do it in the marker again, just to make sure I like it, because once you put an actual pen line down, you cannot go back and fix that very easily. So being super meticulous about this, thinking through where everything's going. I'm gonna do one more marker line just because it's another really important line. I wanna make sure it's right, and that feels good. So now I'm going to throw down the actual marker line. Pen line. Okay, so those are good. This guy next. I don't want them to be parallel. I want them to be kind of coming together ever so slightly. And yeah, so this is coming together nicely. And now I can start thinking through some of the details where I know there's going to be some type of steel frame that holds all together, so I'm gonna add those secondary details in. And you can see it starts to come together. This is the kind of step that really pulls it forward in fidelity. And this line right here is one I was actually debating if I wanted to put down or not, because I knew that I wanted to have grass in the front of this later on. But we'll talk about how you can actually cover up lines in a future segment. Okay, cool. So this is all starting to come together nicely. And now I'm just gonna pick up the speed and go through the rest. And I think this thing is going to be on the ground. So right here, I usually would put another line right here. But what I'm gonna do is instead, I'm going to put my foundation line and kind of chop it up a little bit to kind of show how there's going to be things on the ground in front of it. Like there's going to be probably little boulders and grass and just things that are going to break that line. And this is the kind of thing I was talking about before, where you want to think through these steps ahead of time, because if you don't, then you're going to have boulders or grass or whatever with lines going through it, and it's just kind of make the whole thing look like you made a mistake, whereas if you thought through it in the beginning, you can avoid that type of thing. And I always like putting things like this just because it gives it that little bit extra bit of reality. And also mixing super tight straight lines with a ruler with things that are done with your hand really help to just make this thing look even more visually compelling. And something I'm noticing is that I forgot something. I basically forgot that I was going to put that circular call out. So now, luckily, since I did it with a light marker, it's not gonna matter. I can put something else over it and I can fix that as I go through the sketch. I'm also realizing something else. I originally wanted this to go here, but the thing, as you're doing this, you can always change things around. So right now, I'm gonna have to course correct and fix it a little bit, where this goes to here, and this line is now going to have to go like that, which means that the space between here and here is pretty tight. So what I'll do to fix that is I'll just pull this side back a little bit, which basically moves it a little bit forward. I made this one a little thicker, this one a little thinner. Actually, it's kind of nice. I think this one was a little bit too thin anyway. So now we're going to change that a little bit. This guy's gonna go. I kind of want this. I want there to be enough space for someone to walk. So maybe right here is probably as thin as it can get. So I'm gonna do it with the marker first, since I am kind of recalibrating this. I want to make sure that I don't mess it up. And that feels about right. Cool. All right. So now that I put that down, I realized this didn't go far enough. So now when I put my secondary line down to kind of explain this has thickness, I'm just gonna go and add that by hand. And now this is where you can start going and adding those little details, where I know that right here, I want there to be thickness as well, because basically what I drew there was the top of this whole thing. And it's never a bad thing to kind of go and update your original drawing just to make sure things are going where you want them to go. So now I know I want this to go right there, and I'm realizing I made a slight mistake. See, when you don't work from the front back, you can't change things. And now when I show the thickness of this metal beam going up, there will be a very small amount of the beam below it kind of intersecting, which I wouldn't like ideally, but it's small enough that no one will notice. See, right there, there's a little bit of a mistake, but it'll be okay. I'm also realizing my perspective's going here, so it's about there. So this should actually be a little more like that. Actually, even more like this. It's a little more on the extreme side than I would like, but it will be okay. I'm actually gonna do a different line first. Okay. So it's like that. I want this to go. Then the next one, basically going up and pull it down a little bit and make sure it's all still going in perspective. And the further from the vanishing point we get, the more extreme it's going to be. So that feels about right as well. And I think I want this to be a little bit longer. So I'm gonna pull it down right about there to give that little bedroom area some actual volume. And from here, most of what we're trying to accomplish is coming together nicely. And the only part I'm concerned about is I wish this line and this line are not parallel, but they're pretty close. I kind of wish I had tightened them a little bit more, but it'll be okay. Gotta check it one more time to make sure it's not gonna look really inaccurate, and then I'm gonna go for it. So yeah, a little funky, but everything's not gonna be perfect. And always remember to put those extra lines. When you have two lines somewhere, it always looks more realistic than one, because everything always has a little corner on it or an extra face you're not seeing. Very cool. And I know this is going to go in here to where I want this actual doorway to be. I want the door to be extra high, just to kind of give it a nice feeling. And then technically, you would see a tiny bit of under here. So I'm gonna put a really small line that shows there's an underside to this little room before I put this in. And this is where the lines are starting to get small enough, you can just do them by hand, if you feel comfortable. This is where it also gets hard too, because if you start drawing things that are inside the building, you have to kind of have the furniture in mind, and that's where things can get a little more tricky later when you're trying to actually finish up the sketch with a really nice interior space, but you've already gone ahead and drawn something which is now hard to go and cover up. But something else I want to do is I know I want to have this kind of ribbed structure on the outside. So I'm going to go ahead and just think through how far the spacing should be. And I realized I forgot a line right here. So you can see why I say I like doing things nice and slow and having things that kind of build on top of each other, because you realize things as you go through. And if you do it too quickly or go committing to marker too fast, you don't have the time to go back and fix those things. So right now, I know I want this kind of ribbed metal, kind of corrugated out exterior. So I'm gonna go and add the front faces of all of those. Try and give them some nice spacing between it that's attractive. And also, after every few, making sure my perspective is still correct, because as you go across, they're gonna get tighter because of foreshortening, and they're gonna slightly angle. You can see they're getting slightly tighter as they get further from the front of the building because of foreshortening. And these require a little bit more thought just to make sure they look correct. And I'm getting a little bit tighter than I would like, but it'll be fine when I add some marker to it. You can kind of cover that up. Cool. And now one big gaping hole is I have not added this line right here. So now I'm gonna go in and add that. I'm trying to figure out how I want to actually approach this. You can see it feels a little odd now because this side is shorter than that side, but it's fine. If I was building this in CAD, I'd be able to go back and fix this type of thing. But for now, it's a sketch. It doesn't have to be too perfect. I know my style is very type A. So you want it to be perfect, but inevitably you're going to have mistakes along the way. Okay. So now the next thing I'm gonna do is do exactly what I did here across all of these. Take a little bit longer since it's a longer wall. I'm actually gonna flip it around so I can see what I'm doing. Or if I do it the other way, I'm kind of covering myself as I go, which makes it hard to see what the distance should be to the next one. I'm looking at this, it should start tapering in because this is going to be in perspective. And these should really get small by the end because this distance of this actual face is very long compared to the front surface. So by the end, I won't even have to do two lines. I can basically do one. And I'll start transitioning over there about halfway down. You can see every time I do this, I slightly angle my ruler. This is the kind of thing where you need to have patience, because you can very easily make this look incorrect. But if you spend the time and put the effort into it, that's where you get that extra bit that makes your drawings look really, really great. And now from here, I'm just gonna start doing lines and make them slightly tighter every single time. Because when things go this far from the vanishing point or from the foreground, you just kind of want things to blend in anyway. You don't need to spend too much time on detail. For this one, I'm basically implying that the front porch area with the fire pit and everything is most important, so over here, it doesn't need to get the same level of attention anyway. And now I'm gonna do the same thing for the top. But before I do that, I'm gonna add in, I realized that right here, there would actually be, you can see through this, since the top is going to be glass. So I'm gonna add that steel beam that you can see through this area and give the glass a little bit of structure. So the top's gonna get a metal bar as well. And so is the back. So basically it's the kind of thing where you would lay there at night, you can look up through the top and you'd have some type of nice skylight. And now we're gonna do the same thing up here, where this is gonna get thickness. And now the nice thing is I actually know where all of these should be, so I can have them match going forward. And I can try and pull those across. So it just makes those lines continue with each other as they go. And for here, I think I actually want to switch rulers to a skinnier one. Just going to use this guy. You'll notice these are actually going to look skinnier since they're on an angle. So it's okay if they don't look the exact same thickness as the ones in the front face. And then always stopping and checking, making sure what I'm doing is actually looking appropriate, and it is so far. So now I'm just gonna, as quickly as I can, just throw the rest of them down. And now I'm just going to start doing lines. Since it's far enough back that it doesn't matter if it's completely meticulous or not. That's one of the things I like to do with my style, is make sure that things kind of feel like they're fading into the distance. So even when I'm adding marker, I'll kind of let it bleed and feather off towards the back. So that way the really dense color is up front, which draws your eye exactly where I want it to go from the beginning. Okay, so there we go. We got most of this done. I'm gonna go in and add a few little details that I forgot to do before. For these, just kind of make up weird little blob shapes and figure out what looks good. Okay, so now the next thing I'm going to do is start thinking about the interior a little bit. Right here, this guy is going in, so I know I want to finish up that doorway area. And I think that line I drew is a little thick, so I'm going to split it down the middle to thin it out. Now these guys are going to go like this. And then there's going to be a little threshold piece. And then up here, there's going to be this. Actually, you know what? For extremeness, I'm gonna make one giant door that's like 12 feet tall, just so it's really cool. And then the next thing I wanna do is start thinking about the interior a little bit. So right now, basically, I know this guy ends about there, and then this one ends about here. So this is like, it's basically the interior volume of that area. And for this one, I'm just gonna say it goes all the way to the back, just to have a little more space inside the actual building. But for this, I wanna have a kitchen over here. So I'm gonna, just as before, kind of quickly rough in some type of kitchen area. Just going to get cabinets. And now I'm just gonna relatively quickly kind of throw that down inside of here, because these details are the most important part of the sketch. They're just supporting details. This is something I want to make. I always try and make sure I check my perspective on the interior lines, because they're really easy to make the whole thing look wrong. I've definitely done whole drawings where the exterior looks great, and then I do a few lines on the inside and it completely ruins the whole thing. Because like I said before, nothing's more distracting than having your perspective just be off. Like this goes here. Okay, I'm not loving that line I did. That's all right. Got some really tall cabinets going on up here. And you can't see the underside. I also didn't like that line, so I'm gonna do this. It's fine, I'm gonna have a thicker line over it later. But now I can leave the rest blank, where it's basically like I'll probably have something that has like cabinets going across the bottom. And then the same deal across the top, where maybe actually this is just open down there and cabinets on top. It's something that gives you a nice little kitchen. And something else to think about is where this goes. So this line right here, so you'd see this going through there. That basically makes up this interior volume that we're now thinking about. So like, where do the stairs go? How does that all work? And consider that next. But right now I'm gonna just make it a little bit easier, which is basically figuring out this fire pit thing. Okay, cool. So I'm basically saying there is a big metal box, put wood in it, burn some stuff, sit around with your friends. And then inside of here, I'll just draw some logs or something. There's a little frame around the edge of this thing. I'm putting in now. And then I'm going to put the slats for the deck, which are going to be like this. And it's important to think through this because the thickness of the slats really starts setting the tone for how big the building is, where if you do things that are really big, people intrinsically know that they should be about 6 feet wide, or not 6 feet, 6 inches wide. So if you make them too big or too small, it'll start being distracting. So I'm gonna try and make these on the smaller side. Maybe say they're only 4 inches wide. Always checking back to make sure my perspective is still correct and I'm not drawing lines that are going to look wrong and be misleading. This is honestly a lot of what my style comes down to. It's just being extremely detailed and getting those materials to come across very clearly. And now from here, do them all by hand.